Hey there, folks. Zane from the Infinite Jukebox, aka the #1 London electricity fan, here with another album review. And today, I wanted to talk about the new Nia Archives record, Silence is Loud. Ever since the beginning of the 2020s, producer, musician Nia Archives has been working on this very dance-based, club-based kind of pop soul fusion sound that feels uniquely her own. I mean, infusing a lot of the influences that she does into genres of music that are more applicable to the mainstream in the current day isn't rare, especially the sort of drum and bass and jungle influences present here. Artists like Pink Pantheress have been making that kind of style of fusing different elements of different sounds together pretty prominent within the relative mainstream over the course of the past year or two, and I don't think there's any denying that. However, I would say that Nia Archives is a definitive example of an artist really willing to lean into the influences that make her so unique in the first place until she eventually manages to outclass the majority of her peers. I mean, I really do think that few artists within her general ballpark creatively would have the adventurous sense of creativity to really go in some of the directions that she does here, embracing some of those very intense and at times downright chaotic dance influences. I feel that a lot of the time the incorporation of these drum and bass sounds, these very jungle-based kind of sounds, do lean into the more subtle variety. A lot of artists that do incorporate these sounds that are vying for more mainstream attention than the average underground musician kind of tend to put those off to the side as just a slight influence to make them feel maybe a bit more unique than the rest of the competition. But I mean, Nia Archives definitely doesn't. She's been willing to experiment and go the distance, for a lack of a better term, since day one. After a few admittedly messy but nonetheless highly inspired EPs that laid the groundwork for a soon-to-be much more highly developed sound that has been now heavily associated with the Nia Archives name, her latest record, her first full-length studio album as well, Silence is Loud, manages to be much more than just a beyond excellent full-length studio album, and again her first one at that. Rather, I kind of feel like this at least has the opportunity to be the sort of definitive statement of a certain subsection of pop music in the modern day. This small and very admittedly niche area of popular music at the moment that's fusing together a lot of classic club influences with pop and soul. I really do feel like this record is good enough, consistent enough, experimental enough, yet grounded enough to be the definitive shining example of how great this very specific form of pop music can ultimately be. The various drum and bass and otherwise electronic influences that are being presented here are put forth in a way that I feel is pretty deeply unique within the context of the scene that this belongs to at large, the sort of subgenre, whatever its name could possibly be at this point, that it belongs to. And that's due to the fact that a lot of the instrumentals here don't ever really feel like they're going directly in your face. They act as more of a colorful backdrop to Nia's voice than anything. They definitely aren't the centerpiece of the record at the very least, and that's definitely an intentional move on her and her collaborators' part. And it allows Silence is Loud to feel pretty singular within the kind of niche realm that it does belong to, of this club music, pop, soul sort of fusion going on with all of these breakbeat, drum and bass, jungle influences, because I feel like a lot of records like this would use those club influences as a major crutch for the sake of not having to highlight songwriting or even vocal performances as much. Perhaps I really do feel like a lot of records that are within this realm, not that it's a necessarily bad thing inherently, but I do feel that a lot of records similar to this one would allow themselves to just really lean on the necessity of really putting those electronic club kind of influences directly in front of the listener. But here I feel that things are slightly more restrained without ever letting go of the pure energy that kind of comes with a lot of the influences being utilized here on Silence is Loud, and I think that makes for a pretty interesting listen overall, and definitely a unique one. It's a record that manages to not feel forced, yet at the same time fully embraces the things that make it unique without overdoing it. And that's not to say the instrumentals here are bad or anything like that. They're fantastic. Tracks like Nightmares have instrumentals that are pretty much perfect overall, yet at the same time, I really do feel like they act as more of a canvas for Nia to work upon above anything else here, and I really do feel like a lot of other records that would go in a similar creative direction, go down a similar avenue creatively, would use those same influences as a selling point. And while I do understand that, and while I don't necessarily think that inherently determines whether an album is good or bad, because I mean a record can be fantastic with a lot of these club influences presented in a more direct light. I think the way that Nia and again the people that she's working with here handle those influences is very inspired and ultimately allows for a lot of other qualities of this record to shine. The sort of parallel that occurs on tracks like Cards on the Table between the vocal melodies and the fast-paced underlying instrumentals is something that honestly works out better at the end of the day than it logically should be. I mean, on paper you have a lot of these sometimes soft or at the very least very smooth vocal performances that are being paired directly with breakbeat adjacent instrumentals that are meant to be intense, that are meant to be highly energetic. It just doesn't seem like a concept that should really work, even if it is something that has proven to work for other artists in the past. It just doesn't feel like it should work on paper, no matter who's doing it, until it's actually executed, and it works perfectly in Nia's case. Honestly, the collision of Nia's really beautiful vocal work throughout this record with these hard-hitting dance-based instrumentals that are extremely intense in their best moments, I genuinely think that the execution of that combination there, if you will, is harsh yet smooth in a way that I feel could not really be replicated by anyone else that at least I am personally aware of within the realm of pop music in the modern day. I mean, don't get me wrong, there are artists that I know of that could pull off these vocal performances really well. There are artists I know of that could pull off these instrumentals really well. But I really feel like there are so few artists out there that have the exact kind of charisma, the exact kind of style, and the exact kind of creative direction that Nia has here on Silence is Loud to make this specific sound work well for her. And that's not necessarily me saying that this is the only way that Nia Archives can be good or anything like that. But I will say that I do think that this is easily the peak of her work so far and away the most impressive thing that she's put out to date. And the instrumentals, as you may expect, throughout this record are put together extremely well. I mean, Nia Archives is a name that you may be familiar with if you've known of her work with artists like Georgia Smith or the previously mentioned Pink Panthers, among a handful of other notable people within relatively popular music at this point in history. And I think that Nia's behind-the-scenes experience definitely translates over to her behind-the-scenes work on her first full-length studio album here. And alongside fellow producers Ethan P. Flynn and Jack Wobb, I think that there is some amazing production work going on here. I think this can especially be seen in a lot of the very small auditory details that I would argue kind of reflect the amount of passion that's being put into this record at a pretty constant rate throughout its track list. There's just a number of small, brief passages, or maybe not even passages, just small little moments that really do shine a light on how well made, how well executed, and how much love went into the making of this album. It's extremely obvious, and I kind of love it for that. It allows it to almost feel a little bit more raw by having those extra embellishments, as oxymoronic as it is. It allows the listener to hear, to see, to be able to tell that this is a record that is kind of a passion project above all else. Because it's these minor passages, like the vocal samples or Columbo dialogue on the track Forbidden Feelings, which is originally from her 2022 EP of the same name, or the way that the record opens up with this beautiful whining synth on the title track. It's all these small, brief details that really do add up into something that feels spectacular, something that feels so much more well thought out and lush than you would really be able to tell just by looking at the surface of its style and sound. I mean, obviously, combining various genres into a singular creation in the way that this record does, there is bound to be a fair amount of detailing going into it, but a lot of this record feels unnecessary in the best way, like it didn't need to be as detailed, as developed, as lush as it often is, but it is, and it's better off for it. And in this way, I would actually argue that Silence is Loud is more comparable to an album of traditional club music than it is a regular album of just straight pop music. And that's not me trying to insult pop music at large or anything like that. I just think that you would be hard pressed to find a super mainstream popular pop or soul album that's come out within the past few months that is as heavily reliant and based around texturing as this record is. And when I say reliant, I don't mean that as a bad thing at all. I just mean that when you go into this record, you really find yourself enamored with the general sonic structuring of the album, the way that things are produced, the different synth tones being taken up here, the way that certain details are mixed higher and lower in the mix, the way that some of the breakbeat influences sneak themselves in via the percussion before kind of fading back out to go into more of a drum and bass and jungle kind of style that's slightly more restrained. All of these small moments that you probably won't even notice upon your first couple of listens are really what make this album feel so special. And at the same time, this album never really loses sight of being an accessible album, at being a smooth album that you can pretty easily get into no matter what corner of music fandom you come from. If this is your kind of thing or not, I feel like this isn't that hard of an album to at least listen to. I'm not saying that you're going to love this, I'm not saying you're going to fall in love with this overnight or anything like that, but I feel like even if you're the biggest, like, Hanatarash and Merzbow fan, you just really love your harsh noise, I feel like you can still go into this and appreciate it to an extent. And look, this is not like a criticism on the state of popular music and how this is one of the good albums or anything like that. There is so much phenomenal music coming out of the realm of popular music and pop music right now, and that's just a pretty solid truth, I would say, at this point. Even if you don't like a lot of stuff coming out of pop music right now, I feel that it's hard to not at least appreciate some of it. With that being said, though, I really do feel like Nia Archives here on Silence is Loud creates something that is so creatively and artistically distinct that I can classify it as pop music, yet at the same time, it feels like it kind of transcends any and anything that is popular at the moment. And the actual vocal work that Nia provides here is genuinely fantastic as well, because she has this voice that manages to really strike a nice, very specific balance between polished and raw that comes across as extremely human in the best way possible. I mean, on tracks like Crowded Rooms, for example, you have the way that she admits to her own loneliness and disconnect with other people at her own age, while at the same time feeling like there really is no resolution before the track just actually ends with no resolution. It's this very human, genuine, honest feel where she manages to write some great lyrics at that. I would also like to point that out, while also delivering vocal performances that just feel so earnest and genuine in a way that allows her to come across as not only a charismatic figure, but also a deeply relatable figure as well. Elsewhere, she kind of ditches some of the smoothness for more of an attitude. It's still smooth, it's just less laid back. I'm talking about tracks like Family, and it suits the very percussion heavy sound of a lot of these tracks, while at the same time reflecting a lot of the emotional frustration of some of the lyrical themes that some of these songs bring up, with the aforementioned track talking about family ties and the difficulties of family relationships, or in the case of that song, arguably the lack thereof, so on and so forth. She feels like a versatile vocalist, yet at the same time, she's distinctly her own. She has a gorgeous voice, and even if she doesn't have this extreme Mariah Carey level of range or anything like that, it feels like she doesn't need it, because at the end of the day, what she's writing about on this album is pure humanity and her daily life and the struggles that she often goes through. And I don't think that would convey itself as well if she was doing these massive vocal runs or anything like that. It feels like what she does here on this record, these dialed back, yet at the same time, lovely vocal performances, I feel like it's for the best. And it should say that even if she doesn't have this crazy traditional vocal range or anything like that, that the manner in which her vocals are presented has enough variety to keep things fresh from track to track throughout the record, with songs like Blind Devotion kind of playing around with the idea of bouncing between these smooth, soul-oriented performances and a sensually melancholic sort of distortion that I feel like isn't necessarily too distant from a lot of classic trip-hop bands like Portishead, for example. Again, the more neo-noir side of things within that particular scene of decades that have since come to pass. But overall, I really do feel like Nia just does amazing work here as a vocalist. And look, a debate could be had on what makes Silence is Loud the extremely unique and enticing record that it ultimately is. Could it be the vocals? Could it be the manner in which the pop and soul influences are fused with drum and bass and otherwise club influences? Could it be the songwriting, which is extremely personal and relatable at times, etc., etc.? I really do feel that the complete and total sense of openness and humanity that Nia provides the listener here as she approaches some deeply personal topics of reflection is maybe what grounds the record above all else. And while I do think that every single quality of this album is just as important as the last in terms of making this record the whole that it ultimately is, I really do feel like the pure earnesty, the honesty going on here that is being presented by Nia is what makes this feel like such a true, honest, and completely free album. Whether there's some major drum and bass revival or like drum and bass pop soul fusion movement going on right now isn't really something worth arguing over, if I'm being completely honest. I mean, it all really depends on what social circles you run in, what creative circles you participate in, etc., etc. But I think that the reason why I don't even care to bring up that whole topic any more than just the intro and outro of this video is because Silence is Loud, whether you connect it to a specific scene, movement, or not, kind of transcends anything and everything, both in terms of creativity and sheer quality. This record manages to fuse together various electronic influences ranging from jungle and breakbeat to drum and bass, alongside some contemporary pop, contemporary soul influences in a way that maybe hasn't been seen before, or at the very least hasn't been seen in the last couple of years, or at the very least never to the degree of infectious beauty that is being put on display here in terms of the vocal melodies and in terms of a lot of the earnest songwriting and a lot of the outstanding instrumentals here. And in that between of stunning vocals, great melodies, intense instrumentals, and above all else, this refusal to conform to any expectations that people might have surrounding the kind of experimentation that she does partake in here throughout the record. Silence is Loud is a record that feels like Nia Archives making one of the most definitive albums of 2024. Even if this isn't your cup of tea, this doesn't sound like something that appeals to you, it's a record that I do highly recommend, not only because I just genuinely really love this record, I mean obviously that's a big part of why I would recommend it, but also more than that because I really do feel like this does represent an entire section of fusing genres together, an entire section of genre fusion that is so very fresh feeling, something that feels so inherently modern, this combination of all these club influences with pop and soul. And I really do think that this is something that could potentially define at least a subsection of an entire era of a few different subgenres of music at this point in music history. I mean, obviously, that's not to say that these genres have never been fused together or anything like that. Nia Archives is not a pioneer of a new sound or anything. That being said, I really don't think this sound has been executed as uniquely or as well as what is being presented here on this record. And even if you're totally just filled with apprehensions towards this record for whatever insane reason, come on, man, it's like 35 minutes long. Like, just give it a shot. Come on, please. I'm going to give this record 4.5 stars out of 5. And with that being said, that is the end of this album review. I've been Zane from the Infinite Jukebox. Thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next one.